Okay, so let us go ahead and get started with this review of Locke um, on personal identity. And so remember, these are implications from um, what he says about the prince and the cobbler. So again, remember that's a thought experiment which implies, logically implies certain things, and those things that are implied have to do with this view of uh, that there's personal identity basically involves a kind of continuity. That's what we're supposed to get out of the Prince and the Cobbler thought experiment. And we see that this continuity is evident by the fact that the human being as an organism dies, right? Because, well, in the case of the Prince and the Cobbler, it doesn't die, but it's radically changed. But it is possible to see how if someone's brain can be preserved and the rest of their body dies, as long as the brain continues to function, then the person, because of all the memories that are in that brain, will continue to exist. And that's the continuity that he's talking about. He's basically talking about the continuity of memory. Um, and we talked about what that continuity could possibly mean. It does imply that, in some ways, I think it implies that the person is some kind of object, some kind of thing that continues to exist. This implication is there because, we have to ask the question, well, what is it that continues to exist? Right? If there is something that continues to exist even after the bodies are either destroyed or radically changed, then it has to be something there, right? That continuity has to be a continuity of something, which basically involves this idea that there is something there. Maybe we can call it now consciousness. I don't think Locke uses that word often, but that's probably what we would think of now. And that's the thing that continues to exist, right? And we also saw that memory plays an important role in that continuity, and that's because the person has to remember their past in order for them to identify themselves as that same person, right? So in the case of the Prince and the Cobbler, I gave the example of the prince remembering his 10th birthday, and this is a memory that he could have, and by the way, this is not in Locke, this is just something I made up, I added. Um, he could have a memory of him remembering his 10th birthday, and that is how we have that continuity. That's just one example of how that continuity would be there, right? The prince would say it was me on that day that had that birthday party when I was 10, and so that's how I know that I am me, right? That I am that same person, and that's exactly what the continuity means. So memory plays an important role, and that is because the person has to have memories of themselves in the past, which means that I or that self is the same, that continues to exist, right? One assumption that we talked about that Locke seems to be making is that memory is perfect. An assumption is just a belief, something that is taken to be true. And, in order for this continuity to be there, it looks as if Locke has to assume that we can have all these memories and that we are in fact remembering something that did happen, so that continuity justifies that existence of that self or that person, right? To summarize Locke's view here, memory links the earlier person with the present person. So that is another way of saying that there's a continuity, right? Memory links the earlier person with the present person. Or if you want to think of this in terms of the future, um, basically, in the future, if I have a memory of what's going on now, well, then it has to be memory, a memory that I have in the future about the present that reminds me of what's going on now. And then, I would say, or I would think, well, that was the same me, right? So it doesn't matter if you're thinking about it in terms of the present, the past, or the future. That continuity has to be there in this kind of temporal continuum, right? So that's it. That's an important assumption that Locke has to make. Perhaps Locke didn't have uh, time to think about how faulty memory is, and I talked about how we now know that people have memories that are just false. Basically, a false memory is something that just um, it's about something that just didn't happen, and memory is very flawed, as we now know. So um, basically, Thomas Reid kind of capitalizes on this flaw in Locke's argument, this assumption that memory is perfect is not a good assumption. Um, and that is a flaw in Locke's argument. And so Reid kind of uses that for his purposes to attack Locke's view, and it leaves the question, is personal identity really this continuity, given that there can be these flaws in a person's memory, right? So now let me go ahead and reread the passage where we have this argument that Reid makes. And again, remember, this is called reductio ad absurdum. It's a deductive, valid form. You'll just have to take my word for it now that it's valid, but by the end of this course, you will see that this is a valid form. We're going to actually spend a lot of time getting you there to truly understand what a reductio ad absurdum argument is. It is valid and it is deductive. And so let me go ahead and give you that form, review that form. So remember, in order to understand this, we have to understand that there's a difference between a contradiction and a paradox. Contradictions are bad. We want to avoid them, and philosophers are always aware of the fact of how bad they are, and they will always want to avoid contradictions. All of this involves the nature of statements. So remember, a statement is something that's true or false. We went over that at the very beginning of the course. And basically, in a contradiction, we have a statement and its opposite, which is called a negation. We will actually talk a little bit more about negation later on today. And when you have those two conjoined, we're also going to talk more about conjunction today. When we have a statement and its negation conjoined, then we have a contradiction. So we do have to have a statement, and we do have to have the negation of that statement. And by the way, the negation of that statement is another statement. So we really have two statements in a contradiction. The affirmation conjoined with the negation. Conjunction means and, the use of the and. In English, we express it as A-N-D, and. So here's an example. I am in this Zoom meeting with you, and I am driving on the 15 freeway. That's a contradiction because it is true that I am in this Zoom meeting with you, but it's not true that I'm driving on the 15 freeway. So another way to express what I'm saying is, if I say something like that, well, what I'm essentially saying is I am in this Zoom meeting with you, and I am not in this Zoom meeting with you, right? Because I'm on the 15 freeway. Well, the I am not in this Zoom meeting with you is the negation. And so we do have a contradiction there because we have the affirmation, I am in this Zoom meeting with you, conjoined, right? And I am on the 15th grade, conjoined with the negation, I am not in this Zoom meeting. So remember, that's to be contrasted to a paradox. And a paradox is okay. Those are not contradictions. Paradox are just, they sound funny, they sound weird, but they are fine in terms of logic. So the example I gave is change is the only constant. That is a paradox. It's not a contradiction. It sounds weird to say that change is the only constant, but if you think about it, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say change is the only constant, right? I just mean that things are constantly changing, right? Which is true. It's just that the words that are used there are funny, right? Change is the only constant, right? Constant. The idea of or the concept of a constant is such that it's the opposite of change, right? So there's some kind of opposition there, some kind of conceptual opposition, but no logical contradiction, and that's what matters here. We want to avoid logical contradiction. So remember, with the reductio ad absurdum, we start with wanting to show that a statement is false. Let's call that statement P. So that's how we start. We want to show that that statement is false. And we have to assume that P is true. So the first premise, and then again, remember, you're going to have a whole bunch of premises here because it is a logical argument, right? In the first premise, we assume that P is true. We then go on to deduce further premises, and this can be 6, it could be 7, it could be 8. It's as many as you need. Premises 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. will show that P, the statement that we took to be true, leads to a contradiction. And so in premise 7 or whatever, premise 8, premise 9, we're going to have P and not P. By the way, I chose P there, but typically it's another statement that comes up later, like Q and not Q, or R and not R. It can be P, it doesn't really matter, but keep in mind that by the time you get to the 7th or 8th or 9th premise or whatever, you're likely to have other statements. You will have other statements, and you're going to more likely show that the contradiction comes about because other statements are contradicting itself. It doesn't really matter how we derive the contradiction, whether it's with P and not P, or with Q and not Q, or R and not R. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that we get the contradiction, because when we get the contradiction, we can conclude that P is false. And that is because we have shown that it leads to premise 7, where we have a contradiction. And again, remember, in P7, in premise 7, that could be Q and not Q, it could be R and not R. What matters is that we have that contradiction. So this is the logical structure of a reductio ad absurdum. Again, remember, that's Latin for reduce to absurdity, and the name is helpful there because we're basically showing that the statement that we take to be true has been reduced to absurdity because it has been reduced to a contradiction. And the idea here is that from a contradiction, we can't assume that to be true. So we basically have to believe the opposite. And basically, in this case, we have to believe that P is false. So that's the structure of a reductio ad absurdum, and that's exactly what Reid will do to Locke's view, is show us that it leads to a contradiction. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to summarize Reid's argument. Now we have it in terms of sentences, in terms of content. Let me just point to where this is in the book. I read it last time, so I'm not going to read it again, but it's basically on pages 114 and 115. On page 14 is the paragraph that begins with, suppose a brave officer, he was flogged as a boy for robbing an orchard. So it starts there and it ends at the top of page 115. So I won't read it again, but remember, it's this kind of story where a boy gets flogged for robbing an orchard, and then he gets promoted. He becomes a general as a man, and he takes the standard, which I think means he wins a battle, and then he, I guess, retires from being a general, becomes an old man. And so basically the memories here, if he had a perfect memory, right, he would remember his youth, and that would be the same person. But as we'll see, that's the problem. So what I'm doing in premise one is I'm summarizing basically Locke's view. I am the same person if I remember a specific event. And this is another way of saying personal identity is memory. Again, remember, for Locke, that means that it's that continuity, right? The prince remembering earlier events, right? That's the summary of that view. So what we're going to do now is show, well, what Reid is going to do is basically show that that leads to a contradiction or to an absurdity. And so we can't really philosophically accept Locke's position because it leads to this contradiction. So premise 2, the officer is flogged, and this is punishment for robbing an orchard. So that just states that as a kind of a fact, something that happens. Premise 3, the officer takes the standard from an enemy in his first campaign, in his first battle. And again, I take that to mean that he wins that battle and takes the standard or the flag from the enemy. So again, we take these events to be true. We assume they're true, because again, remember, we have to assume that these premises are true in order to see that the argument is valid, right? To show that it's valid. Premise 4, the officer is promoted to a general as an older man. Again, this is just kind of part of the story, but we're interpreting them as premises here, as things that we take to be true. Premise 5, the officer remembers being flogged as a boy at the time when he takes the standard, right, at the time that he's a general. Premise 6, as an older man, the general, the officer remembers taking the standard during his first campaign battle, but doesn't remember being flogged. So, he's gotten old, his memory is beginning to fail him, and so he remembers taking the standard, but doesn't remember his childhood where he's punished or flogged for robbing the orchard. So that's premise 6. Again, we take that to be true, right? We assume it's true. Premise 7 basically states that Locke must allow that he who was flogged at school is the same person who took the standard, and he who took the standard is the same person who later becomes a general. Premise 7, if you think about it, is a nice way of summarizing the continuity, right? The continuity of memory. And so this has to be true according to Locke's argument, right? That the person who was flogged at school is the same person who took the standard, and it's the same person who took the standard that later becomes a general, right? That has to be taken as true, a premise that has to be accepted as true if this argument by Locke is going to work, right? If Locke's argument is good, if it's valid. Well, premise 8 states that by premise 7, the older general is the same person who was flogged, right? That's just a deduction we could make, something we can deduce from premise 7, right? Because the older general is the same person who was flogged. He remembers it as a general, and then he remembers it as an old man, right? And premise 9 says, since the general does not remember the flogging, the general is not the same person who was flogged, but according to premise 7, he is the same person, and that's where we get the contradiction. So basically, if he forgets, right, if and it's easy to see how he can forget, then we will get a contradiction. If the general, as an older man, doesn't remember the flogging, well, then he's not going to be the same person who was flogged. But according to premise 7, he is the same person, because remember, premise 7 basically states that that is the same person throughout, right? And so we get the contradiction in premise 9. And again, I'm interpreting the argument here, premise by premise. But Reid is very explicit about that contradiction. Let me read on top of 115. He says, Thomas Reid says, but the general's consciousness does not reach so far back as his flogging. Therefore, according to Mr. Locke's doctrine, he is not the same person who was flogged. Therefore, the general is, and at the same time is not the same person with him who was flogged at school. That right there is a very nice summary of the way that Thomas Reid states the contradiction, right? The general is the same person, and the general is not the same person. So notice how we get the contradiction that I was referring to earlier, where we have an affirmation conjoined with its negation, right? The general is the same person, and the general is not the same person. And that's exactly what a contradiction is. Again, remember, it's a statement conjoined with its opposite, with its negation. So remember what this means. This means that we have to conclude that premise one was false, right? I am not the same person even if I remember a specific event. Personal identity is not memory, right? And that's because I might forget another event, and then that continuity will not there, which will lead to a contradiction. So that's the argument. Again, remember, there's a logical component to this because it is a reductio ad absurdum, and it's valid, which is to say that it's very well reasoned. But another key important point here is that we have Reid pointing something out that Locke just didn't foresee, and that is that memory can fail. Well, if memory can fail us, then why should we think that is the condition for the possibility of the I, right? Locke is kind of arguing that memory makes that I possible because it is through memory that we can be aware of that continuity, right? We can have consciousness of that continuity. We can only do that through memory. And so he is basically arguing that memory is that condition for the possibility of that continuation of the I. But again, you know, if memory is shaky, if it's not perfect, which we now, again, like I said earlier, we know it's not. There's so many psychological studies now that show that memory is very flawed. Well, then that whole thing is on very shaky grounds, right? That whole continuity of the I, that continuity of the self is on very shaky grounds. So that's it. That's the argument.